Hello, my name is Amy Wilson. I'm an independent advocate from Blackpool Advocacy Hub. This presentation will explain the different statutory and non-statutory advocacy services that are provided at the Harbour by Blackpool Advocacy Hub. This presentation has been designed in order to explain the difference between these roles and the different functions that these roles serve in relation to supporting patients, whether they are detained under the Mental Health Act or are informal patients. The provision of IMHA services were introduced as a result of the amendments made to the Mental Health Act in 2007. Section 130A of the Mental Health Act sets out the statutory requirements and regulations relating to the role and provision of IMHA services. Chapter 6 of the Code of Practice defines IMHAs as specialist advocates that support patients to understand and exercise their rights under the Act. IMHAs will also support patients to understand the rights of others, such as the responsible clinician and the nearest relative. IMHAs will support and encourage patients to understand the care and treatment that they are receiving and will ensure that the patient's voice is heard in any decisions relating to their care and treatment. The Mental Health Act and Code of Practice sets out the role of IMHAs and the functions that they must provide to patients. The Act enables IMHAs to support patients to exercise their rights, which can include representing them and speaking on their behalf, such as supporting and representing patients at CPA meetings, ward rounds and hospital manager meetings. IMHAs ensure that patients have access to the free legal representation that they are entitled to and can support patients to instruct a solicitor and complete applications to the tribunal. The involvement of an IMHA does not affect a patient's right to seek legal advice or representation. IMHAs will work alongside solicitors and share relevant information with the consent of the patient. IMHAs provide an independent and confidential service where patients can voice any concerns that they may have. IMHAs will visit the patient on the ward and are contactable over the telephone if a patient needs to speak with them before they are due to visit the ward. The Mental Health Act gives certain legal rights to IMHAs that must be upheld to ensure that IMHAs can fulfil their role under the Act. IMHA services are independent, confidential and free of charge. IMHAs have a right to access and visit the wards where patients are residing. IMHAs have the right to meet with patients in private unless the patient objects to this or meeting them privately poses risk to the patient and/or IMHA. IMHAs must be invited to attend meetings that concern the patient's care and treatment, especially if the patient has requested that the IMHA attends. IMHAs also have the right to visit and speak to any person who is currently concerned with a patient's medical treatment for the purpose of supporting the patient. With a patient's consent, IMHAs also have the right to access clinical records that relate to the person's detention or treatment in hospital, or records that relate to aftercare services provided to the patient. Patients who are eligible for an IMHA are referred to as qualifying patients under the Act. The Act clearly sets out which patients are legally entitled to an IMHA. These include all patients detained under the Act, patients subject to guardianship or community treatment orders, and patients that are liable to be detained, such as those currently on leave of absence from the hospital. Qualifying patients are informed of their right to an IMHA whilst being read their Section 132 rights. Informal patients are not entitled to the statutory support of an IMHA. However, this will be discussed later in the presentation. Detained patients should first be informed of their legal right to an IMHA whilst being read their Section 132 rights, and patients may request the support from an IMHA as soon as they become a qualifying patient. The Act is clear that hospital staff have an obligation to support patients to access advocacy, and the IMHA must also comply with any reasonable request to visit the patient. The Act states that patients should have access to a telephone where they can contact an IMHA and speak to them in private. IMHAs will only work with patients when they have obtained their consent, and patients are entitled to refuse the support of an IMHA at any time. IMHAs are led by the patient and will not act without their consent. The Act provides guidance for IMHAs supporting patients that lack capacity to understand and consent to the support of an IMHA. In these instances, IMHAs will use various non-instructed advocacy approaches to ensure that the patient's views and wishes are heard and their rights under the Act are being upheld. IMHAs will represent patients that lack capacity at any CPA, best interest or discharge meeting. IMHAs have the right to access patient records where they lack capacity in order to support them whilst they are detained.
Hello, my name is Leanne Geegan and I'm a Senior Independent Advocate with Blackpool Advocacy Hub. Apart from IMHAs, there are patients in the Harbour that are entitled to the support of an independent mental capacity advocate. IMCAs do not serve the same function as an IMHA, and an advocate can act as both an IMHA and an IMCA for a patient. IMCAs are statutory advocates that are instructed under specific criteria for patients that lack capacity where a best interest decision under the Mental Capacity Act needs to be made. IMCAs provide a statutory safeguard to individuals that lack capacity in relation to important decisions that need to be made and have no one that can be consulted as part of the decision-making process. An IMCA will support and represent the person throughout the decision-making process and will work with the person to establish their views and wishes regarding the proposed decision that needs to be made. IMCAs are instructed when a decision needs to be made around a proposed serious medical treatment or a change of accommodation decision. IMCAs are instructed to provide support to the individual that lacks capacity around the specific decision that needs to be made. The IMCA will work with the person in order to establish their current views and wishes on the proposed decision, or will attempt to establish what the person's views and wishes would have been when they had capacity. An IMCA will attempt to achieve this by accessing records and speaking to a variety of individuals involved in the person's care and treatment. IMCAs will ensure that the person's rights are being upheld under the Act and will challenge any part of the decision-making process if they are not. IMCAs will represent the person at any best interest meetings, where the IMCA will have the opportunity to raise questions or challenge decisions that do not appear to be in the person's best interests. The Code of Practice clearly sets out in its guidance where an IMCA needs to be instructed for patients that are detained under the Mental Health Act. IMCAs do not need to be instructed for patients that are being treated for their mental disorder, and if this treatment can be given to the patient without their consent as authorised under the Mental Health Act. However, IMCAs must be instructed for patients who lack capacity and require serious medical treatment that is not related to their mental health. The Code of Practice lists the following as examples of serious medical treatment: chemotherapy or treatment for cancer, major surgery, major amputations, withholding or stopping artificial nutrition, termination of pregnancy, and therapeutic sterilisation. Where patients lack capacity, have no one appropriate to consult, and a decision needs to be made over a proposed change of accommodation that is likely to be longer than 8 weeks or longer than 28 days if the stay will be in a hospital, then an IMCA will need to be instructed. IMCA referrals are often made before or during the discharge planning process, so the IMCA can contribute to the best interest or discharge meetings. The decision maker must take into consideration the findings of the IMCA, which will be detailed on a report written by the IMCA. A record of the IMCA report is to be kept on the patient's records as a requirement of the Mental Capacity Act. Motivate 2 is a volunteer-led advocacy project provided by Empowerment. The project is led by volunteers who use their knowledge and own personal experiences of mental health or complex needs to empower and support informal patients at the Harbour. Our volunteers will help informal patients to understand their rights whilst they are in hospital and will empower patients to ensure that their voice is heard. Our volunteers will meet with informal patients at the Harbour, will support them at meetings, and can raise any concerns or issues on their behalf. Although informal patients are not detained, there are parts of the Mental Health Act that apply directly to them, and our volunteers will ensure that patients understand all information relating to their rights. As discussed on the previous slide, informal patients do not qualify for an IMHA but are entitled to support from our Motivate 2 project. Informal patients are only entitled to an IMHA and they are being considered for treatment under Section 57, or if the patient is under 18 and being considered for ECT or any other treatment to which Section 58A applies. Informal patients are not detained under the Act and are not subject to the same restrictions as detained patients. Informal patients have agreed to come into hospital voluntarily and are aware that they need treatment for their mental health. Informal patients have the right to refuse any treatment that is offered to them. Treatment without consent can only be given in an emergency. Informal patients are free to leave the ward at any time and can only be stopped from doing so in specific circumstances. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Please get in touch if you have any questions about IMHA, IMCA and the Motivate 2 project. Please use the contact details provided on this slide or speak to us in person on the wards. Thank you.